Hi, everybody, and welcome to another edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. Glad on this episode to be talking with author AJ Hartley. AJ, welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the
Thanks, Jason.
show.
I appreciate you inviting me to be on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you for saying yes. And I appreciate your work. I believe you have a book that's forthcoming that might have inspired your background that we'll talk a little bit about, and we'll talk about a few other things as well.
Yes.
So I like to start with sort of the author origin background question of what inspired you to begin this path in the written word.
Um, I know it's a common question, but it's still a good one. I think I started out as a storyteller, as an oral storyteller.
Mm,
I grew up in a working class industrial town in northern England, and my schoolmates, for the most part, were not what you would call bookish, which of course is not to say not smart, but we weren't raised in a very sort of literary culture. Most of the people I went to school with were going to get jobs in factories or of one kind or another.
mhm.
Very few people went to university. Most people left school at 16. And so, you know, and I used to, I think I was always a bit of a storyteller. I loved, ghost stories and things like that, particularly local things, which I used
Mm.
actually in a novel not that long ago. But I grew up with those stories. I grew up, with kids telling stories literally around campfires and things like that. But I I discovered reading when I was, I don't know, about 11 or 12. I don't think I had been much of a reader before that, really.
Mm, mhm.
I mean, my parents were both teachers. So it was a thing for them to sort of encourage me to read and so on. But I didn't start getting into reading until I started reading fantasy,
Mm, mhm.
particularly like C.S. Lewis, but then also Ursula Le Guin, the Earthsea books, particularly, and the Lord of the Rings, of course, and then also sort of murder mystery. So, in this period, because of course I was born in the early 14th century, so there wasn't what we would call a real YA market.
Yes, uh-huh, true, true.
So there were children's books and then there were adult books, and there wasn't really a whole lot in between. And what there was never particularly, I mean, I read things like The Famous Five and Secret Seven, which were a sort of the British equivalent of sort of Hardy Boys, Nancy Drew type
Mm,
stuff.
mhm.
But fairly quickly, I started reading, Agatha Christie and Sherlock Holmes and those kind of fairly kid-friendly mystery thriller type things.
Yeah,
So that's where I started, and and the first things that I wrote were along those lines.
yeah. Well, and that taps into a couple of areas that I was going to ask about. One of which is the voices that have inspired you.
Mhm.
Um, so I love how a range of genres sort of appeal to you. And then you also you've crafted in a lot of different genres as well, from fantasy to science fiction, literary, historical, mystery, and things of that nature. So all of that makes perfect sense for the work
Much
that
to
you're doing.
much to my agent's frustration. Yes, I'm like, yeah, I'm the publishing nightmare because the way that you build a profile is by basically doing a version of the same thing over and over, right?
Mhm.
So that people, when you say somebody's name, they have particular sets of a particular style or genre that they associate with that author. And I've never been that. And part of it is because um, because, as you say, I always read widely. So why wouldn't I write widely? Because I was always kind of still in that sort of storyteller mode, and part of the fun of being a storyteller is that you're telling yourself the story.
Hmm.
So why would I write things that I didn't want to write? If I got bored with something, I want to hop to something else. And I had a conversation quite early in my career. I've been with my current, I mean, I've been with the same agent for 20 years now. And when we sold my first book, which was a thriller and sort of archaeological mystery thriller, and it was, I think, the eighth novel that I'd written. So because I'd been doing it a long time.
Hmm.
Um, but we sold that, and it was pretty successful. It came out in a lot of languages, and shortly after it was accepted by the U.S. publisher, by Penguin. My editor, my agents, I was talking to her on the phone, and she said, "So you're a thriller writer?" And I was like, "Wait, wait, 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 wait. No, I happen to have written a thriller, and I've written another thriller, which I'm going to do after this. But
Hmm.
as you know, I also write fantasy, and I could feel, her anxiety through the phone, because especially in those days, this was what, well, as I say, what, 18, 19 years ago when I
Hmm.
published my first novel. In those days, there was even less a crossover. Is that true? There was less crossover in the sense that because people relied exclusively on physical bookstores, if you were writing, if you had successfully written mystery and then you wrote fantasy, that was in a different part of the store. And the
Hmm.
audience literally wouldn't follow you from one area to the next. Most of the time, they wouldn't know it existed. They'd look for you in the section that they associated with you, and they wouldn't move over. Now, that changed, I think, when people started buying more books online and
Hmm.
everything
Hmm.
is listed by author or something like that. But I also wonder if we have not, for other cultural reasons, further subcompartmentalized ourselves thereafter. You
Yeah.
know, I've met people at conventions. I once met somebody, I swear to God, this is true, who was looking at some books of mine on a table, and I started to tell them about them, and she said, "Well, I only read books about werewolves with green eyes,"
Wow.
which is pretty niche,
That's pretty niche.
right? But apparently, she seemed to be able to find enough books that filled those categories to keep her busy.
Wow.
Yeah,
And so if you get to one with red eyes, I guess you're out of luck.
I guess. I'm saying, I don't even know. I wouldn't even notice what color their eyes were most of the time when I was reading. But yeah.
Hmm.
So yeah, so me, I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, yeah. So for me, I've always been a genre hopper. Um, and and that has been sort of generated by different things. I've told this story before, but a number of years ago, I was working on a series about a crime scene photographer. And as part of the research, I got permission and did all the background checks to do ride-alongs with the local CSU unit.
Hmm.
Um, and I was doing that, and I remember coming home like 4 in the morning and saying to my wife, "I'm not going to do this," because the experience of being at actual crime scenes was so depressing
Mm. I'm
and
sure.
not glamorous and not cool and not sexy. It was just sad. And I was just like, I don't want to write this.
Yeah.
And my wife said, okay, so what's next? And I had a similar conversation with my agent. She's like, okay, what are you going to do next? And I said, well, I want to do, this comes back to what I was saying before. I want to do
Hmm.
for my son what happened to me. I want to write a book that a Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe type story that gets me excited about reading.
Hmm.
So I wrote a middle grade adventure. fantasy story, the first Darwin Arkwright book, and
Mhm.
so that was a hard shift in terms of the direction my career was going in.
Yeah, yeah. But I love that though. I love the genre play, and I love when authors have that sort of range, and you can find them in different places. And it's interesting that the marketing side of things tends to typecast people so much.
Yeah. And I think actually, I mean, I wouldn't say this of my own stuff, but certainly I think that when writers are using lots of different genres, that makes their genre stuff more interesting
Hmm.
because
Hmm.
they're less likely to slide into the familiar tropes of that genre.
Yeah.
And I think you learn different skills, you build up different muscles, as it were,
Hmm.
when
Hmm.
you're writing different kinds of things. I think, I mean, a complete novel is always going to have to be, you want great dialogue, but you also want great action scenes and evocative description and all, and different, those different component parts, I think, get emphasized in different genres. And
Yeah.
if you are moving between them, then hopefully you're building all those skill sets that you can then bring to bear in a single book. I don't know if
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
makes sense, but
Yeah. Well, one of my questions was going to be if you had to pick a genre to have on a desert island with you, or a deserted island, what would it be? And so I don't know that I want to necessarily force you to choose that way. It
it would
sounds
be
like
very
you've pushed
hard.
against that. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be really hard for me to choose because, and partly this is, I don't know, I have the attention span of a finch. So I'll read a book and I'll get excited about it and I'll want to read more of that.
Hmm.
And I'll do
Hmm.
that for a few. And then I'm like, okay, I'm done with that now. Now I want to go in a completely different direction. So yeah, I'm sure there are plenty of authors who could answer that question right off the top of the head, off their head.
Yeah.
I would really struggle.
Yeah.
Uh,
And so I'll mention a couple of titles. The Cathedrals of Glass series
all
being
right.
one of those. And then also Burning Shakespeare, which takes you to the literary historical, but also the idea of some fantasy happening as part of that too. And then you've novelized a couple of Shakespeare plays as well. Yeah.
I have forgotten about that for a split second. What's he
Yeah.
talking about? Oh, yes.
Which have some really lovely audio versions with people like Alan Cumming
Yeah.
reading Macbeth and things like that. So
Yeah.
there's a lot out there to explore.
Yeah. The Shakespeare things that I did, I probably, because by trade I was a Shakespeare professor
Hmm.
until about 3 weeks ago. And I mean, I still am. I'm a professor emeritus. I'm still associated with the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, but I am effectively retired. But for 30 years, I've been a Shakespeare professor, and I avoided people. My agent's going to hate this interview because it makes me sound like, and this is not what I mean at all. But she would occasionally say, "Oh, you should do a Shakespeare thing, so a novel connected to Shakespeare," and I never wanted to because it always felt like work.
Yeah, yeah.
And whenever I tried, I would slide into lecture mode, and the
Hmm.
story would get kind of forgotten while I sort of discoursed on something I thought was interesting. Um, and so I think, the Hamlet and Macbeth adaptations that I did were co-written with a British mystery writer called David Hewson.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I don't think I would have done them without him. And his background is totally different, and his sense of Shakespeare was totally different. But it meant that we were building something quite different that wasn't just me waxing lyrical about Shakespeare, you know.
Yeah,
And I think it's part of the strength of those books.
absolutely. Absolutely. So we'll shift a little bit to talk about middle grades and young adult, because that's a good place for us to talk about. And you mentioned that um, not that long ago, those areas of reading did not exist, which was certainly the case when I was growing up. You sort of went from the school-based Newbery winners, and then you found something adult, or you just didn't read.
Right,
For
exactly.
me,
Yeah.
that was like Michael Crichton and um, some of the science fiction stuff that was being published at the time as well, Ray Bradbury and some of those things. Um, but we now have this world of middle grades and young adult, which brings us to Hideki Smith, if I'm saying that correctly.
You are, yes.
Demon
Yeah,
Queller, yes, which
yeah, I moved.
appears to have inspired your background.
Never miss a marketing opportunity.
That's right, that's right. So what would
It is
you like
pretty though, isn't
to
it?
share?
Beautiful cover.
It really is. It really is. It's very striking.
I can
Um,
say that because I had no involvement in it at all. So,
so what would you like to share with listeners about this book?
um, so after my so this is it's set in North Carolina. It's set in the mountains
I'm
in an
familiar with that
imaginary
area.
town. Yeah,
Hmm hmm
in an imaginary town, a small town where there is basically one Japanese American family, and it's focused on a high school boy and his sister, Caleb and Emily. Caleb's middle name is Hideki, and strange things start happening in the town, and suddenly we are awash in North Carolina with creatures from Japanese folklore, and it's clearly somehow connected to their family, and so they have to sort of um, figure out how to become the heroes that their town doesn't know it needs, uh,
hmm
while simultaneously figuring out who they really are. So, and it's very much an identity book. And I should say that, after my undergraduate degree, I lived in Japan for a couple of years. I taught English. I worked effectively for the Japanese Education Ministry, but what that really meant was I was teaching in a high school,
hmm
where I met my wife, who's Japanese American, and we have a mixed race son, and they are co-authors on this book.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
so yeah, you
Nice,
can,
nice.
because of the way that this image behind me is sort of squashed, you can't see that they're it's AJ Hartley with Hisako, Osako, and Kuma Hartley. Because for years I had been trying to write some version of this story, something that drew on Japanese folklore and mythology, but I couldn't figure out how to do it. And then part of that was because I kept trying to set it in Japan, and it
hmm
didn't work. Um and in the end, the story sort of came together when I thought, this is not my story, it's my son's story. So
hmm
it became a story about what it's like to be, somebody of mixed heritage, specifically in the US, and the way that a lot of particularly, well, I don't want to overgeneralize, the way that Japanese Americans sometimes have sort of sacrificed versions of their own heritage in order to assimilate,
hmm
and the way that people, well, let's put it this way. The first time that I mean, we go back to Japan quite a lot, but we didn't when my son was very young. And the first time we took him there he was about, I don't know, 12. And he absolutely loved it. He had a blast.
hmm
And so much, it was almost sort of weird, to be honest, because he had not grown up particularly interested in or knowing about Japanese culture. He wasn't a manga reader or an anime watcher. He wasn't listening to the weird Japanese rock music that I listened to.
hmm
And and so I said to him, what is it that you liked so much? Because he was like, when can we go back? When can we go back? When can we go back? And at first he said, well, I really like the food. And I'm like, okay, but we can get the food. We can. And after a while he said, um, well, it's really nice to be somewhere where everybody looks like me.
hmm hmm
And that was a real sort of gut punch, to be honest. And I was like, because I was like, okay, so there's stuff here that I haven't fully processed, the
Yeah.
things are going on that I don't know about. So those are things that we talked about a lot. And so all that stuff found its way into the book, and it shaped the book. It's like, okay, so let's write about this
Mm,
in a fantasy setting, in a way where, that sort of classic Buffy the Vampire Slayer model. Is it too early to call Buffy the Vampire Slayer classic?
no, I
Um,
think it's good. I think that works.
in that, the central motif of that show is that high school is a hellscape, right?
Yeah.
That the things that you're battling are monsters and supernatural forces, but really they're a kind of manifestation of what you're going through in an
Hmm.
attempt to figure out who you are and define yourself as an adult, right?
Hmm.
So this is a similar kind of story, and it uses a similar sort of device to sort of embrace these elements of Japanese culture, which the characters are largely unaware of,
Hmm.
and that
Hmm.
they're sort of wrestling with and trying to figure out, you know, who they are.
Wow. No, no.
So,
I love the co-authorship, the family project aspect.
yeah,
Um,
and it's not, and I don't mean that we're sitting down together and writing a sentence at a time each or something like that. I'm the principal writer,
mm,
but and their involvement is mostly in conversation and in fielding questions and in talking and then in reading and scrutinizing and saying this is not right. Let's change this. Let's rethink this, providing editorial feedback and various other
mm,
things. There's a glossary that appears in the book with all the sort of Japanese terms and monsters and things defined. And my wife, under the tutelage of her 93-year-old father, has hand painted all the kanji to go with them and stuff like that. So
mm.
yeah, it's a group effort.
Love it. Love it. But I also love the folkloric aspects. I love the mingling of that with the small town because that comes with its own sort of trappings. So looking
Yeah,
forward to seeing the book out in the world, and I love the identity aspects of it as well.
one of the things that I think Japanese folklore is particularly rich in is in shapeshifter mythology.
Hmm.
So many different animals and beings that can change their shape, and I think they're perfect for this kind of story because it suggests on this very basic level that nobody is what they seem to be.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, so it's a kind of running metaphor.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, looking forward to seeing the book out there, and as a way of wrapping the conversation, you're of course welcome to mention anything that we've missed, but I always like to ask about web spaces where people can connect, places where you'd like to direct them for information about the book and things like that.
Sure. My website, which is where most things go, is ajhartley.net, and you'll find all my stuff there and various sort of links and things connected to specific projects. You can also find me on Facebook and Twitter, though I'm less active there, and on
Mm,
Instagram as AJ Hartley, something like that. AJ, I think it's just AJ Hartley, and I have a
mm.
YouTube channel under Andrew Hartley, which is where I talk mostly about Japanese rock music.
Nice, nice. I'll link the YouTube channel when I share this, and I'll also link the website on the audio version. So, anything that I've missed that you want to make sure to share before we close out the episode?
Um, I don't think so. This is actually, you may be the first person recently to have interviewed me and not mentioned Tom DeLonge of Blink 182.
Oh, well, there you go. There you go.
Because usually that's what everybody wants to talk about.
Right, right. Well, and we can have another conversation about that sometime if you'd
All right.
like. All right. Well, thank you so much, and glad to share about your work.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.